in terms of reducing extreme poverty and sustainable development. And for many years now, we've been trying to translate this also in a careful, results-focused type of agenda. So in terms of trying to make sure that in all the things we do, we have a clear assessment, both ex ante and ex post, in terms of to what extent do our actions contribute to achieving reduced poverty, although we would consider it in multiple dimensions, not necessarily in income poverty only, and try to see it. So it's the question, the other part of the question that you ask in terms of the question of attribution and contribution, it's of course a really, really difficult one. And you can, if you want to do in monitoring frameworks and so on, you can have very reasonable ways of trying to attribute and try to think through, if you know, working with your partners in countries, with governments, you can have all kinds of ways of trying to make statements of, you know, look, we have contributed here to some progress in certain indicators. But for me, the main thing here is that it only matters, and I see this even in my own organization, if it actually generally means forms of incentives. If it generally means that we are doing certain things and try to actually being motivated and organized around trying to achieve this, rather than something like, you know, we give, say, in particular countries, 5% of the education budget, so therefore let's simply allocate 5% of any change in learning outcomes to our efforts. Then it actually is just instrumental and doesn't incentivize anything. So for us, the discussions are now not so much on a very simple level of attribution, but actually, can we actually see whether our adoption of a results focused around poverty reduction in our programs, does it actually help us to try to do certain things in certain ways, try to do it better, trying to find ways of incentivize both ourselves and our partners to work on it. And then secondly, whether exposed, are we criticizing ourselves? Do we do on self-criticism if it doesn't contribute really that much, or if we have to admit that we're not succeeding, that we have failures and so on? So for me, the question is all the times comes back to not so much of some kind of instrumental way of attributing a fraction of results that are achieved because we happen to have spent money in a particular area, but actually are we designing things, and are we being critical enough exposed in trying to assess whether we really have contributed to achieving some of these goals?
Well, if I understood you correctly, in your original statement, you were talking about the impossibility of having any seeing any result from parts of the world where the poverty is so dire that you're barely holding the line, not holding the line. But well, if you were to withdraw from that, I mean, you're looking at the negative result instead of the positive result.
Well,
so is looking at the positive result dangerous?
No, I wouldn't say so. For us, actually, the important thing is actually slightly the reverse from the implication you got. And so clearly, I haven't expressed myself clearly. I think for us to try to, us globally, to trying to get to these goals of 3%, we have to be conscious that the places we're trying to work will get increasingly more difficult. You know, some of the easier places to make progress in extreme poverty, we at least would judge we have actually been working on. We're coming to far more difficult, messy places, fragile states with difficult partners sometimes to work with, or even willing partners, but an awful lot of conflict and other related problems, that actually we need to just be even more focused on trying to get to contribute to these results. I don't think neither DFID nor anyone else has the magic formula of actually trying to make strong progress on growth and poverty reduction in some of these difficult places. I simply want to say, if we're adopting these kind of goals globally, we just have to be conscious that our efforts in these very difficult places will have to increase, and it's not business as usual. What Martin describes as the pessimistic scenario is arguably saying is pessimistic in a sense that we're not going to really make much progress in these more difficult places. I would actually say the goals are great because they would motivate and incentivize us to trying to really start tackling some of these more deeper and more complicated settings.
I think we're going to turn to the audience for questions, and the online audience is also invited to please submit questions, which will be handed up here. There are microphones on that side of the room. There's one, and I think is there some way to reach a microphone on this side? Okay, there's a microphone. We have the panelists obviously are interested in continuing the discussion, so what we need are a couple of provocative questions. Okay, here's somebody who's going to run the microphone around. My old neighbor from Georgetown.
Thank you. Just two brief comments and one question. In fact, this target of 3% by 2030 is achievable, but basically the countries themselves have to take responsibilities for them. Because unless you have the good policies and the right institutions, then World Bank actually cannot do much about it. It has to really, World Bank has to really have a facilitation role, but the countries have to take the major responsibility for it in terms of having good policies and better institutions.
All right, I think we're ready for the question.
Okay. The question is, in fact, to Professor Noura Lustig. You mentioned about the regressivity of the indirect taxes, but in many countries, if you have a progressive direct tax, like income tax, and if you really increase the tax base by having a strong enforcement, you can have a good amount of resources, and that can be used for poverty reduction. So my question is, cannot we not also focus on direct taxation, which is progressive in nature?
Your microphone has, we have.
Well, I mean, thank you for the question, because it's. Let me say one thing that I have been, with the work that we're doing now, we're doing some of the projects with the PREM, with Christina Manbert-Calvo, who's here, and Gravila Inchauste, looking at the incidence of taxes and transfers in a bunch of countries, and then also in Latin America. I want to make one distinction between, people use regressive with using it as if it was exchangeable with whether it's anti-poor or pro-poor. Turns out that taxes can be progressive and anti-poor because, you can have a system that taxes relatively more the rich than the poor, but it still taxes the poor, and depending on how much transfers they get, they may be poorer after the fisc than before. And we do find that in some countries, and by the way, in many countries, we also find that the bottom 40% are net payers to the fisc, meaning that when you add consumption taxes, they're paying more into the fiscal system than what they receive in cash. They receive other services, but I'm talking about cash, so something to ponder. So I think that we need to look at this as a whole and distinguish indicator of inequality from the one on poverty. Right now, the IMF is putting a lot of emphasis on fiscal policy and inequality, and I never dreamed I was going to say this, but it's putting too much emphasis on inequality and not enough on poverty. Because, like I said, you can have both. So you can devise a system that maybe is neutral or slightly regressive, but the point that I'm trying to make is look at what happens to the poor. Even direct taxes are progressive, or may hurt the poor if they pay taxes. So you have to see whether it's possible with what you collect. Are you going to be able to compensate the poor if you want to use 125 as the threshold, whatever threshold you choose? Are you going to be able to compensate when you take into account the direct and indirect effects with the amount they're collecting in order to not leave them worse off? And that's not always the case. That's not always the case, and that's a concern that I think the bank has to take very seriously when it does the policy recommendations in terms of how to propose combinations of taxes and transfers if you do not want to end up not just with higher poverty. By the way, sometimes the poverty levels don't change, but when you look inside, you may see people who were made poorer by the system because other poor were made less poor, and you have impoverishment, maybe not increases in impoverishment, but you have fiscally driven impoverishment of people that were poor or were made poor by that. That is something to be concerned. And I'm sure, when you're working in the Ministry of Finance, you can see that. We don't want that. So we have to find a way to measure that and see whether we have the instruments to compensate if we want to use the revenues for other investments as well.
We have another question down here.
I'm Marvin Taylor. I'm Director for Evaluation, and we have this huge response for private sector in the World Bank Group. We have this huge responsibility of trying to measure the contribution of the World Bank Group. So I want to come back to topic as Martin said. So if that is the trajectory, as we know, and as you presented it, what difference does it make to set up a 3% rate of extreme poverty for the bank to set it up, right? Where in that, along this line do you see the contribution of the bank group? These are goals that can only be achieved by the countries, not by the bank. And so related to this, Stefan is talking about holding the bank accountable, for the bank group accountable for that. But accountable for what? If these goals, again, can only be achieved by the countries themselves.
Martin?
That's always been understood, and it's actually never I was involved in this from day one. There has never been any presumption on my part, or in the early discussions, that this is what we're claiming the bank will do. What we are trying to say is that hopefully the bank can have some leadership, or at least with its main stakeholders in the international community, including institutions like DFID, to mobilize global effort in this direction, supporting countries in their own efforts as well, but also trying to nudge them a bit in cases where they're not making those efforts. But at the end of the day, it is, of course, exactly, it is the countries will do this themselves. It's not something the international community will do. It is something we will help and facilitate. But don't underestimate the power of that mobilization globally to help in that effort. And also, and this is a bit of a response to Stefan, please don't underestimate the power of data. I'm doing a history of thought on poverty. It's coming out in a book later this year, but I'm struck in that history, and maybe I've got biased eyes, but I'm struck with how much power and influence basic data has had in the history of thought and in the history of policy making. Repeated instances when the shaming rich people by telling them how poor people lived has been so powerful repeatedly. And I think doing that well it's demonstrated benefits in informing policy. It doesn't answer all the questions. I mean, I think Stefan said, I wrote it down, something like, poverty is not reduced by collecting data. It kind of sounds, oh no, of course not. Well, actually, maybe it is. Maybe it's an important part of that process. And I just don't want to, I don't think Stefan would disagree. I don't want anybody to get the impression out of this that data is not hugely important to that effort. But it will be an effort of countries themselves. Absolutely. That's how we've done it in the past, and there's no obvious alternative. I'm also quite skeptical on aid, by the way. I don't think development aid is the engine of this process at all. I think it's what countries do. Development aid may lubricate the process in ways that can be important at certain times in certain places. It can also do damage as well. I think it's more getting that consciousness in all the relevant stakeholders that is extremely important.
May I?
Secretary, you want to add something to that?
Yeah. Well, on the importance of data, data are my armaments. Whenever I faced members of Congress and the executive branch, and they are so powerful indeed. Numbers like this could make or break, make the difference at all in the policy advocacy. A lot of the time, in the absence of good data, I just have to trust my intuition, back of the envelope kind of thing. But that's better than not using any numbers at all. but it only reinforce what I'm saying earlier, that we need to invest in good data, because from my perspective as a policymaker, the rates of return are very high. I think the costs are actually not so much, but the power of data, when used properly in advocacy and for reforms, cannot be underestimated. That I see in my own work in government, but I see that in my interactions also with other governments, at least in my region, in East Asia.
Right.
Stefan?
So if I quickly may add, of course, I spent my whole career collecting data. They're of course important, but the point I want to actually make is that the power from data comes from the way we use them and the way we ensure that they're used and brought forward. And I think we can still do far, far better with trying to get the right examples, the right data, the kind of right analysis into practice.
Without cherry picking.
Without cherry picking, exactly, which is a very important thing.
It's hard to reconcile those two things.
Yeah. Well, it is, and that's actually why the data collectors should be very conscious that data can be easily cherry-picked. My very first job was actually doing a consultancy of how poverty data were being used in developing countries, and the conclusion was essentially the only thing that was used was the headcount poverty, which was in the beginning of a speech on the state of the nation kind of speech, and otherwise nothing was being used. So you need to kind of keep on pushing. And similarly, I work now enough in public policy. Policymakers love examples, and they love to present an example as if it's a median, but they actually pick it somewhere on the bottom end or the top end of the distribution so that it serves their purpose. So it's all about the way we use data. But data are power as long as we use that power properly. But I want to also say on this accountability point I was mentioned earlier, of course it's countries that will have to do it. And also aid, as Martin says, or indeed any lending, none of that will actually really achieve these goals. If you were to ask me how much lending should a bank do or how much aid should a donor community spend to reach the 3%, my answer would be infinity at the current rate, because it has a lot to do with what actually otherwise happens. Is the other things that will be far more important. We can't calculate the cost of achieving these goals in that sense. So it is working with the countries, and they have to do all the non-aid parts, and the non-funding part has to happen. But doesn't mean we shouldn't be accountable. No, we are using scarce public resources, and we should be held accountable in terms of saying, are they being used as well as we can to contribute to these goals? And that's internationally the case, that's for each agency the case, and I would say it's for the World Bank as well.
Carolyn, I think we're getting very close to the end here, so why don't we'll call on Carolyn Hyder to sum up what has happened here.
All right, thank you very much. Really, really inspiring conversation. Thanks to all of the panelists, and also thanks to the audience for the questions. I think what was really good, and thankfully the slide is still up there, the importance of the goals and how we set them. So the slide would have been fine. The point that Martin made, that when in 2000 the goal was set for 2015, it was set at a percentage of the population. It wasn't set at an absolute number. Now the percentage has been reached, but the absolute number is more or less the same. So what does that tell us? The importance of setting our goals for 2030 is to make sure we know where we're going to come out at the end, and whether it is really going to improve the lot of the world population or not. The second big chunk of important contributions was about the role that these goals play. And Stefan made a very good point about, are these goals just a gimmick for communications, or are these goals actually incentivizing behaviors? And how do we make sure they incentivize the behaviors so that we then take actions, whether it is informed policy making? Linda made a number of examples of, let's make sure we do not do any harm with our policies, with our interventions. But then also, how do we get into what Stefan called the very messy part, where it's either in fragile countries, or RCD has talked about, making that next step. Even when you have big growth, it might not actually reach the poor. You might not actually get to the bottom percent, and it's not just the 40%, it's the people much, much lower than that. So using data in ways that we are more aware of what our policies achieve and what they do. Then we had a lot of discussions about how do we make sure the data systems actually work. And again, Martin made a very good point about that maybe earlier on we were in a better place because the data was more comparable. And the importance of coordinating the efforts and consolidating and having more comparability. And here again, yesterday's event on the data revolution spoke about the World Bank Group's commitment to investing in building national systems for statistical data, and that with that and its convening power, I'm sure there will be work done on agreeing on what the standards should be and keeping those stable so that we can do comparability. But I would like to also end on a word on evaluation, and we had some words about sometimes the data gurus sort of pick cherries, or the politicians even more, they pick examples to illustrate a case. And this is where the role of the evaluators come in, because we take an impartial look at all of the different data sets, all of the interventions, and try to make sense of that to understand what has really worked, what has made a difference, and why. And in the why lies the answer for how do we change how we work and how do we become more successful. So I would like to thank the panelists and the audience for this very inspiring conversation, which we will take back to our offices and think about what does that mean for our evaluation methods and practices. So thank you very much.